All right, old school style, quick video. A lot of you guys have watched my analysis of basically after the first couple days when Russia invaded the Ukraine and what was going on. And things largely stayed the same for, I guess, up until maybe a couple days ago. The realities on the ground are very much the same. Everything I said about basically what the tactical objectives of what the Russians are and what the tactical objectives of the Ukrainians are. However, the entire basically northern attack to try to basically make the capital subdue, the Russians have cut their losses and decided that that was not worth the resources that they was draining to try to. They weren't going to take the capital, and if they did, it wasn't going to be the killing blow. Now, had they asked me, they would have known that. But hey, their intelligence was obviously very bad, and also their military preparedness was extremely poor. And I don't think they would have done this knowing what they know now. Now, they're trying to save face, and this is a lot like the Finnish Winter War. They want to make basically a Ukrainian counterattack to retake the areas in the east they lost so painful that the Ukrainians are willing to negotiate rather than actually fight. They are taking a large gamble, and if they had done this faster, if they had put all their effort in the south, or if they had actually, been confident enough to actually cut off the Ukrainians' access to the Black Sea, they could have negotiated that, and then probably the fight would be a ceasefire. They probably would have taken that territory in the east. They may have even held more territory in the south than they would have gotten otherwise. But obviously, the push it failed. What they were trying to do failed. So now they've basically entered stage 2 of the war. What we're going to see is what I had said originally is that they are going to do everything they can to cut off the Ukrainians' access to the Black Sea. They need to push in to take Odessa. And if they can't take Odessa, Ukraine will not fully capitulate. But what they need to do is take the territory they have and hold it hard enough where a Ukrainian counterattack is not likely to be successful or to be so costly to the Ukrainians that they would rather negotiate away the territory. Here's the problem that the Russians are running into, is that whether it's propaganda or true or not, the Ukrainians and largely the rest of the world feel that the Russians have basically been committing war crimes. There's words like genocide being thrown around. And a lot of that is, in my opinion, I think a lot of it's nonsense. But what it is you're seeing basically old school 1930s, 1940s style heavy artillery, urban warfare, for lack of a better term. Like basically it's like East Berlin. It's like when the Soviets were pushing back across Europe in the 40s. And it's very destructive. Everyone is at war. It's almost the concept of total war at that point. The Russians, if they're rolling into your town, they're probably going to level your house because, well, in their opinion, they don't have a choice, because you could have a rocket launcher and pop out your window and blow up one of their tanks. And that's largely what the Ukrainians are doing. The Ukrainians are using every bit of cover they can, every building, every office complex, every apartment. They're going to be fighting for every single inch. And one of the reasons they're doing that so fiercely is because the Russians have come in with the excuse of, quote unquote, denazifying Ukraine. Yeah, this might work for in terms of your propaganda strategies at home. What it is not good is to feed that to your own soldiers, because what you then end up having is basically radical action. You have prisoners being treated horribly, you have executions, you have civilians just being willy-nilly killed, and you have basically total Soviet saturation, a Soviet-style saturation of these areas that they've besieged. And if you are a far superior force, or basically the writings on the wall, like in situation in the 40s with the Germans, where they were getting attacked from the west, they could not hold out indefinitely. You can get away with that, and you can do some horrible shit. You can do basically what the Soviet Union did to Eastern Europe. Right now, though, that's not the case with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are much better organized, better armed than they ever have been, better funded than they ever have been, and they've got a reason to fight. You start going in and you basically just start throwing everybody into the Nazi category and executing and mass graves and all this other stuff. The Ukrainians are going to take that as essentially you're basically coming to exterminate them. And that means there's not going to be any negotiation. There's not going to be any surrender from the Ukrainians. It's going to be a bloodbath. And the Russians should have realized that this cuts both ways. And this is largely actually what happened with the Finns. It wasn't necessarily denazification in the beginning of the war, but towards the end of the war, especially whereas basically the Winter War was over, World War II happened, the Finns were not going to be rolling over because they had allied themselves essentially with the Germans because the Germans were the only ones close enough to actually give them support to stop the Soviets from invading. So they just had to just do what they did. And then in turn, the Russians were like, oh, we got to denazify Finland and we got to denazify all these other places. Well, Finland's not going to tolerate basically the way the Russians treated the Germans on themselves. They don't see themselves as Nazis. They don't see themselves as aggressors. They see themselves as basically people who are doing whatever they can to survive. It's a rough situation. Very, very rough. But suspect basically fighting in the south to intensify and expect Odessa to be one of the key spots. There's a couple major cities along the route. I'm actually surprised the Ukrainians have held on as long as they have, despite everything. Ukrainians will be launching a counterattack. Watch for buildup of BMPs, troop transports, and once their Air Force kind of gets their act together, they're running out of planes, basically. It's just through attrition. Seems like they got plenty of pilots, but the planes are the issue. They didn't have a particularly large Air Force when this started, but their pilots are very well trained, and that has been shown demonstrably in terms of basically the Ukrainian successes in the air versus the Russians. I don't want to say lack of success, but their complete lack of combined arms coordination, which is something that surprised me, and it surprised actually a lot of analysts. We had overestimated the Russians' Air Force capabilities, and it's a good thing. It's good that they suck, but it's surprising. So that's pretty much what's going on with that. I might do a video on Zelensky. I think a lot of people, he's worshipped by some people, and he should not be worshipped. But he's also saying whatever he needs to say to make sure his country gets the support they need. So take a lot of this, especially the green energy stuff and the filleting of basically these globalist neoliberal stuff. Just take that with a grain of salt, because he's saying whatever he needs to say to get the support for the people of Ukraine that he needs otherwise. So, is that lying? Well, I don't know. If your country's survival is on the line, you kind of will say whatever you need to say to make sure your people get the support they need to stop the Russians from doing what they're doing. So, is Zelensky good? Is he bad? I tend to think he's probably a force for good, but we don't know. Some people are heroes, 1 year, and then the next year they go full tyrannical. So, I don't know, but the point is he's the guy they got, and he's willing to do and say whatever he needs to make sure the Ukraine survives. And even if that means he says stuff I don't like or don't agree with, I completely understand why he's saying that. Because it's not so much lack of principle as it is him screwing up and pissing off, for instance, like the Biden administration. He didn't have nice things to say about them when they were lying about basically Zelensky and Trump investigating the Hunter Biden laptop stuff. We realized that, the people worshiping Zelensky now didn't want to hear what he had to say when he was talking about the Trump stuff, what Trump was impeached for. But now, but he's now basically being super friendly to the Biden administration, saying things they like him to say. And it's just to make sure he gets the weapons and the gear and the food and all the stuff he needs, because they are unfortunately highly dependent on the West. And the more the West basically supports them, sends them weapons, food and stuff, the more likely the conflict is to have less bloodshed, or I should say, the less the Ukrainians are likely to lose in the long run. I get it. It's tough. I would hope the Russians would realize their error and just come to the negotiating table now. The problem is that, for them, I should say, is that they've now given the international community and the Ukrainians license to counterattack. They've given them enough time to build it up, and they've given them enough time to get both the troops, the equipment, and the political motivation to launch a counterattack and completely push the Russians out of the Ukrainian borders. And the Ukrainians didn't have that when this whole thing started. Had they had that, they would never have allowed the Russian troops to cross the Ukrainian border into Donbass and the eastern provinces in the first place. So Russia has overplayed their hand. They now are risking losing the gains they made because they decided to try to do this crazy thing and basically get Ukraine to completely capitulate. If the Russians were more competent, they could have gotten away with this. But they obviously are not. The West was still very slow, all things considered, to supporting the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainians just still don't have the aircraft they need. But the Russians were even slower in terms of their advances. It's quite the interesting fight. I think military historians are going to look at this and really scratch their head. Basically, where modern warfare fell apart. That such a lesser country, in terms of strength on paper, can hold the line against essentially the combined force of the entire Russian armed forces, Army, Navy, Marines, and the whole thing. And in a place where the Russians were very familiar with, in the place the Russians had invested lots of intelligence and lots of drills, with an ally bordering the Ukraine, the Belarus participating. The fact the Russians have failed as hard as they have is quite telling. I imagine that probably makes the Chinese very nervous, because the Chinese have a very similar doctrine to the Russians. They were emboldened by us screwing up Ukraine, but we screwed up Ukraine not because the military was incompetent, but because the politicians were incompetent. In this case, the politicians thought the military were more competent than they were. Putin gave the military everything they needed, quote unquote, then they said they could do it, and they clearly could not do it. It's very different. It's the opposite problem of the West, where the West has the equipment and the technology and the very sharp sword, but the hand that wields it is weak and feeble. It seems like the Russians have a big strong man with a strong leadership and a very very solid, basically, political base to go bring about war or basically pursue the policies of whether it's Russia or China or Belarus. But when it comes to them swinging their sword, they bring it down on a lesser foe, and it does not cut like they were expecting it to cut. Interesting. We just have to watch. It's one of those weird things where I can't tell you what's going to necessarily happen. I can tell you what their goals are for the most part, but we don't know. We really don't know. This whole thing could collapse in the Ukrainians' faces. I doubt that at this point, but it's not impossible. The Russians could get pushed out by a full counterattack, or the Ukrainians could build up the forces they need for a counterattack, and the Russians could just say, okay, we're done. We're signing off. Let's just negotiate this. This is going to end in serious bloodshed. And as the Ukrainians are looked at as the good guys in this situation, do not expect them to be saints when they push out the Russians, and particularly go back into these territories like Donbass, where there were Ukrainian citizens who sided with the Russians. Those people are not going to be treated well. In some ways, Putin has now created the crisis for ethnically Russian Ukrainians that he claimed was existing as his pretext to go into the fight. He's now created that problem. Not completely, particularly in the West. I should say the ethnic Russians sided largely with, and I say largely, like very largely, with the Ukrainian government, because that's who represents them, because they see themselves as nationally Ukrainian regardless of what their ethnicity is. Not such a luck in the East, but what that means is that when these quote unquote ethnic Russians are now going to be in the territory that the Ukrainians push and retake, they're going to be looked at suspiciously as, did you help the Russians invade? And that's not good for them, and it's not going to be basically probably the shining moment of mercy for the Ukrainians. It's going to be a bloodbath. It's going to be very bad, and this is this is war. And this is particularly war in Eastern Europe. This is just kind of what happens. So, Russians made this very bad, and they made it worse for the ethnic Russians in the Ukraine. I feel just horrible for the parties involved. I mean, not obviously the Putin types who created this mess, but even the Russian soldiers, they're pawns in this. They've been told one thing, and you can be told something that's a lie, and you can go fight for something that's a lie, but you better damn well have the strength to actually win the fight. Otherwise, really bad things are going to happen. So I guess we could just pray and hope that the Europeans, or I should say the Ukrainians, have total victory in the sense that they don't feel the need to start going, house to house and hunting down the Russians, the ethnic Russians, to go stop them from, siding with the Putin or whatever it is. If and then likewise with the Russians, they're doubling down on the whole Nazi thing. So they're going, they just look at shelling your house as well. It's a Nazi's house. Who cares? It's a mess. So let's hope for the best. And I suspect this war is probably going to drag out a couple more months. We may just be looking at indefinite fighting in that region for, half a decade at least. But I suspect probably the Russian people are not going to be able to sustain what's going on. Putin has put all his chips on the table, and he's lost most of it. So, is that good for Russia? Is that bad for Russia? It's yet to be seen. It's embarrassing for them. This whole thing has been just utterly humiliating for the Russians, which is why they're desperate for a victory. They're desperate to be in a position where they can negotiate and keep a piece of what they took. They're desperate. They will do anything to do that, because then they save face. Their honor is saved. But I'm going to be honest, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. It doesn't look like they're going to get anything. So that's all.